I'm Tina Gardner, the convener of the Wilton League of Women Voters. I want to welcome you, voters, guests, and our candidates.
Stay closer, they can't hear you.
Mr. Arora and Mr. Himes, to the League's 4th Congressional District Debate. The program is sponsored by the 10 leagues which are located in Connecticut's 4th Congressional District, and with the assistance of Wilton High School's Model Congress. We thank all of them for their helping to make this debate possible, and we hope that you will find this program informative and useful as we approach Election Day on November 6th. Now, we proudly introduce Kay Maxwell. Kay has served as president of both the League of Women Voters and for the state of Connecticut and the League LWV US. She is presently a member of the League in Stamford, Connecticut. Kay will be our debate moderator, and she will share opening remarks just before the debate begins. Welcome, Kay.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I just have a couple of procedural matters I'd like to take care of first. I'd like to remind you that we ask that there be no applause or other expressions of approval or disapproval during the event. It's distracting to the candidates, and it takes away from the time they have to respond to the questions concerning the issues that we all care about. In other words, we would appreciate it if you would make your feelings known about the candidates in the voting booth on November 6th, rather than by applause this afternoon. Your cooperation will be sincerely appreciated, and at the conclusion of the debate, I obviously encourage you to applaud as loudly as you wish. But now is the time also, please, to turn off all cell phones or any other devices you may have on your person that may beep or make other kinds of sounds during the course of the debate. I also want to note that all cameras and recording devices in the audience must be turned off as of now. The rules state that there is to be no taping, photographing, or tweeting during the debate by members of the audience. You should also be aware that the candidates have agreed that no part of the program may be used without written permission of the League of Women Voters. Tina mentioned that it's the number of leagues here in Fairfield County that are co-sponsoring this event, but I'd like to mention what they are. And that's obviously the State League, the League of Connecticut, and then Wilton, Bridgeport area, Darien, Greenwich, New Canaan, Norwalk, Reading, Ridgefield, Stamford, Weston, and Westport. And obviously, we are all pleased to be the organizers of this debate between Democrat Jim Himes and Republican Harry Arora. They're both candidates for the 4th Congressional District seat in the House of Representatives. Our purpose is to provide you with an opportunity to hear their views on issues facing the nation. I would also like to acknowledge a guest in the audience this afternoon, the CEO, relatively new, but the CTO of the League of Women Voters of the United States, Virginia Case. Virginia, thank you, and I think you're sitting somewhere in the front row. The format that we're using this afternoon is designed to allow the candidates time to discuss the issues. The only rule is that the total time used by each candidate by the conclusion of the debate be approximately the same. I'm going to be posing the questions which have come from the League and audience members here, but the candidates will not be restricted to 1 or 2 minute responses. Instead, they may spend as little or as much time as they feel is appropriate to discuss each issue. Our goal is to encourage some debate. The candidates will alternate being the first to respond to a question, and following the question period, each candidate will make a 2-minute closing statement. Members of the League of Women Voters are serving as timers for the debate, and they will keep me and the candidates informed of the time expended. Obviously, if a serious imbalance in time used occurs during the course of the debate, I'll call it to their attention, and we'll see that it's corrected. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the candidates. To my immediate left is Republican Harry Arora. And you can applaud. And to his left is Jim Himes, Democrat. Okay. Now that you have that all out of your systems, the position on the candidates on the stage, the order of responding to questions, and the order of their 2-minute closing statements were decided earlier by a draw. So now let's get to the debate. And the first candidate to respond will be Harry Arora. And the question is, what should or could Congress do to strengthen the security of our election infrastructure, technology, and our voter registration databases throughout the country? Mr. Arora, you're first to respond.
Well, let me thank the League of Women Voters for organizing this debate and for giving me this opportunity. And I'm glad Mr. Himes agreed to it, and we are doing this debate. Look, I'm a friendly guy. I know you didn't want to sit with me out in Norwalk. I don't bite. And I'm really glad that we're doing this. Now, as you mentioned, as we know, that elections are very central to our democracy. And I think the good news is that we have a very diversified and decentralized system. And there have been calls to make it more centralized. I do think that the federal government should spend more resources in ensuring that all the individual jurisdictions have the right technology and the ability to ensure fair elections. Now, there's one area where we need to do much more, which is information warfare, which is other people influencing the elections by manipulating information. And because much of the news now is obtained through a very variety of different sources, I think that's where we need to be on guard. I don't think there's very clear areas where what we can do, but at the same time, we need to be on guard that large media companies don't sway or favor one participant or one party or one idea over the other. And that's where we saw information warfare was done by those outside and those within. And I think we need to make sure that it's fair and that information warfare doesn't happen or influencing doesn't happen. Thank you.
Mr. Himes?
Thank you, Kay. And let me also begin by thanking the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this debate and so many other debates in the region as we approach Election Day. Let me thank my wife, Mary, who helps me keep my head on straight. And I want to thank Harry and his wife, who are 2 of the 4 people in this room who know what a 24/7 congressional campaign looks like and know that you can actually OD on Chipotle burritos. With respect to election security, as a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, I've spent the last 2 years since the last election of 2016 marinating in the attack that took place on the electoral system by the Russians, which started out in an attempt simply to create anger and division in the populace, to bring down both candidates, and ended in the final 4 or 5 months in a very brazen attempt to elect our current president. And so I think there's a couple of things that must be done. Number one, the United States must speak with perfect clarity when we are attacked. And of course, I'm making a reference to the President of the United States, who has waffled over these 2 years about whether or not the Russians in fact attacked us. If we can't, and starting with the most bully pulpit in the country, be very clear about what happened to us and what we will do about it in the future, we're going to have a problem. Second, I would say there's a lot of technological and technical fixes here, starting with one, and I won't go into lots of them, but starting with one, there are still 12 or 13 states in this country that do not use paper ballots that would allow an audit should somebody be able to break into the computerized election equipment and change results, which of course is sort of the sum of all of our fears. Connecticut, fortunately, is one of those states that does have a paper ballot, and you'll see that in 2 weeks, and you've seen it before. We must cooperate between the federal, state, and local governments. In this country, elections are run by municipalities, which is a great thing. It actually helps keep us safe because there's no central system in which the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else could break into. But sadly, in the 2016 election, lots of states and lots of municipalities were not interested in hearing from the experts at NSA or at the Department of Homeland Security. We need to do better to make sure that what the folks deep in the NSA, and these people are very, very good, know get conveyed out there to those secretaries of state and registrars around the country. Two other things I would mention. Number one, we have, I think, a really interesting conversation to have, and I won't sit here today and tell you I know the answer. I looked at the Facebook ads that the Russians bought. I looked at the Twitter posts that had Latinos and African Americans, and it said, if you want to vote for Hillary Clinton, you don't need to go to a polling place, just text this number. We need, and again, I don't know the answer because we have a First Amendment in this country, and I don't think you want the government telling Facebook or Twitter or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal what they can and can't say. That's a tough conversation. Lastly, and this is the one I probably feel most passionately about, we need to understand that the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Korea, all the usual rogues want us at each other's throats. They want us to believe that the only truth that you can find is on Fox News if you lean right, or on MSNBC if you leave left, or that crazy tweet is truth. We're citizens of the United States. We're participants in a democracy. That is not free. That implies a responsibility to know that what you're hearing, even if it makes you feel good, may not be true. And it may be put out there to make you angry at your neighbor.
Yeah, I want to quickly bring out one more point. I do think that we want to make voting easier, but there is a little bit of overreach going on where we do not want to require people to provide IDs when we vote. I do think that's a dangerous path. We need to make sure that people who are voting are ones who are citizens of this country, and we need to make sure that we do enough precautions on that. While I am in full, I really would like our voting percentage to be higher. That number needs to go up, but we need to protect against that. And I know there has been an outreach from the other party here to say, well, we don't need even any ID, any form of ID. Just come and vote. And that many times leads to fraud. And fraud is a very big thing in elections we need to counter. And finally, the media bias. I hear what Jim just said, but a media bias is immense right now. Most media is very left. As a result, people like me, challengers, get no airtime. I have been calling and station after station, media outlet after media outlet, and they've shown very little interest because they have an agenda. I know they are on paper they will say they're very fair, they're balanced, but the amount of time I get compared to what Mr. Himes has gotten is just a fraction. And so I do really think all of those issues are big, important, and need to be tabled. For fair elections, we need to make sure everybody gets equal time for debate, equal time to present our ideas, and even look at these debates. We wanted more. Now we are here 2 weeks before. As a challenger, that's very insufficient. So I really do think we need to make a lot of progress on these ideas here. Thank you.
Ready for the minute? Go ahead.
I'm going to thank Harry, I think, for saying something that takes some courage for a Republican to say, which is that we should not require identification at the polls. I think I heard you say that, Mr. Arora, that we shouldn't require identification.
No, I said we need to have IDs at the polls.
Oh, okay. Okay. In that case, I'm not going to thank you. Okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
Comes back.
I misunderstood. Look, we all agree that elections must be secure, but make no mistake, Mr. Arora just said election fraud is a big thing. That is factually wrong, and I know you're not supposed to go on your devices right now, but Google anything, and you will discover that every year, individual voter fraud, that is to say somebody who shows up at a polling station and says, I'm somebody that I'm not, numbers in the double digits with hundreds of millions of votes cast. The percentages out there are tiny, absolutely tiny. So no, voter fraud is not a big thing. It's not even a small thing. It is a tiny, tiny thing. And the problem with voter IDs is, of course, there are Americans who don't have IDs. And who are they? They are elderly African Americans in the South. They are older people who no longer have driver's license because they're not driving. It might be some younger people. I'm not going to go where you know this leads you, but when African Americans in the South, when younger people are disenfranchised because they don't have an ID, it favors one party more than the other. And that is why every single voter ID effort you have seen has been promulgated in a red state.
Ready for the next question? All right, Mr. Himes, you're first to respond. Excuse me. I have several questions that relate to gun control, gun safety. So I will simply ask, what ideas do you have for reducing gun violence? This questioner says in our schools, but I would say in our schools or elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Of course, it's the gun violence in our schools that shocked all of us sitting here 10 miles from the Sandy Hook Elementary School, and shocked us at Parkland in Florida. A murderer going in with an assault rifle and killing a bunch of children is probably the most atrocious thing that any one of us can imagine. And that's a very big deal. And that points us in the direction, in some very important directions, school security. I've been doing this now for a little while, and I used to walk into schools, elementary schools, unchallenged. There's not an elementary school in the county now where I don't press a button, somebody asks me who I am, I stop, there's often guards, I think that's fine. But make no mistake, there's 36,000 Americans killed every single year as a result of, by firearms. 2/3 of those deaths are suicides, and that's why it's important to take the question beyond schools. The other 1/3, talk to the moms of Yana. This is a support group in Bridgeport for mothers who have seen their boys, often, usually, killed on the street. Here's where what Connecticut did, and I really applaud the state of Connecticut, universal registration. Wherever you buy a gun, you undergo a background check. Limits on assault weapons, not confiscation, but no, you don't get to buy a new AR-15 anymore in the state of Connecticut. Limits on the number of magazines. If you can't get done what you need to get done hunting with 10 rounds, take up golf. These are what the state of Connecticut did. I will work hard in future, and I wonder if on those 3 counts, my opponent would work hard, because that would be different in the House of Representatives, to pass what is already keeping Connecticut a lot safer. Now, that's 1/3 of the 36,000 gun deaths. What about the suicides? 2/3. I just sponsored, not just, 2 months ago, I sponsored a bill because I realized that a lot of those deaths and a lot of other deaths actually could be prevented if only the owner of a gun could use that gun. The suicides, of course, are a stressed out teenager who finds his dad's gun and succeeds in committing suicide. Well, you all have these. I put my thumb on this and it allows me and nobody else in. There is technology, smart gun technology, that if we could propagate it, and I'm not talking about making it mandatory, just I don't happen to own a gun. I like shooting, but I don't happen to own a gun. If I owned a gun, I would demand smart gun technology, because I got 2 daughters, and the last thing I want them doing is stumbling into my room, finding a gun, and using it. So anyway, some combination of all of those measures, if we could make progress on that, would make this country far, far safer than it is today.
Mr. Arora?
So I absolutely believe that responsible gun ownership laws should be promoted. And I have 3 little kids. I send them to school every day. And I know as much as anybody else that we need to make sure that our laws are strong and gun violence is reduced, if not, and actually, hopefully, eliminated. Now, there is a framework I follow for gun laws. For responsible gun laws, we need to make sure that laws actually reduce violence, gun violence. Number 2, they are implementable. Right? If you say, well, I'm going to pass a law and I'm going to take everybody, change, for example, just what Jim suggested, we would love for every gun to have this technology. There are 350 million guns out there, to really go back and fit them with this technology. It's just not implementable. And are they in line with our values and our Constitution? So all of those 3 principles allow us to come to a set of laws which will generate consensus, agreement, and progress. Now, what is happening right now? What is happening is a rift, a diversion between people who own guns and people who oppose guns. It's getting us nowhere. I'm not a gun owner, but I do believe that we have to bring everyone together, right? And the way you bring everybody together is to have someone with credibility out there saying, well, I'm not partisan. I'm not basically only representing the gun opposers. I'm also representing the gun owners. And that's how you build credibility. When Mr. Himes goes around on TV saying Australia-style laws are applicable, well, Australia does not have a Second Amendment, and they did confiscate guns. And then he says, well, we shouldn't be confiscating guns. That's not what I'm asking. Well, you may back out of the comment. I understand that. But you have lost credibility with 120 million gun owners. And now what's going to happen? Nothing's going to get passed. And that's where we are. You've been working on these stuff for 10 years. Not much has gotten done. I really think, for example, the universal background check at the federal level is something which we definitely need to work and get done. And someone like myself will have the credibility with both sides. The moment I announced my candidacy, I went to both sides and asked, what do we need to do to reduce gun violence? It is something we need to make happen. These are laws we need to bring people together, bring both the gun owners segment as well as those who oppose them together, and push for these laws and make them happen. And that's what I intend to do.
So, Australia. I was on CNN one morning right after Parkland, and they asked, what do other countries do? And I said, look, there's lots of countries where people where people can have guns, but they've responded to bad situations by implementing different gun control. And I pointed specifically to Canada, to the United Kingdom, and to Australia, where in 1996 at Port Arthur, 35 people were murdered by somebody with an assault weapon, and they radically changed their gun laws. Then Tucker Carlson invited me on his show and said, you favor confiscation because you mentioned Australia. Now, you all know that if I say that in the UK and in Canada and Australia they've done different things, some of which work, I'm not saying confiscation. Tucker Carlson knows that too, but he's gotten very, very rich by pretending that he doesn't know that. Now, Mr. Arora, just as he said voter fraud is a big problem, is now wrong about gun safety. This is not a fight between gun owners and non-gun owners. This is a fight on, let's just take universal background check, because that's probably the most doable thing. 96% of Americans believe in universal background check. The fight there is between the vast majority of Americans and the NRA. And it says something about the power of that institution and other gun safety institutions that despite the fact that almost all Americans would like to see gun safety, it can't happen. So this is not a question. I'm not a gun owner, but I am fully in support of the Second Amendment. I actually like shooting. I don't want to own an AK-47 or an AR-15. I would be fine only having 10 rounds in my magazine, and I would be fine undergoing a background check. My guess is that most of you agree with that, which illustrates that this is not a fight between gun owners and non-gun owners, as Mr. Arora would have you believe. This is a fight between people who are reasonable, and I'm suspecting that Harry and I probably don't radically disagree on those measures, and a very small group of very wealthy people who are doing the gun industry's bidding and causing havoc on American streets in the process.
And that's where I say Mr. Himes is totally not talking to people. Because when I go speak to people who own guns, they believe that he's going to go take away all guns. It's all incrementally. That's what his agenda is. And maybe they're reading him wrong. Maybe so. But he's not even talking to them. They are bad people. That's what they perceive. It's not a one-sided what he thinks it is. It is also a perception on the other side. And that's why laws can't get passed. We can't get consensus. You need credibility. That's how consensus is brought together. And Mr. Himes has not gotten credibility. He has not built consensus. That's just a fact. And I agree. The universal background check is perhaps the one which we need to first, is the easiest or most important thing we need to get done. Now, let me also get back to the idea of voter fraud. Elections are always won on the margin. The last one vote can influence the election. So when Mr. Himes said, well, it's a small number, it's only 1%, quarter percent, well, all the really tough elections get won only by a few votes. So let's just be clear that at the margin, most of the time when we see fraud, we always see in those constituencies where elections are very tight.
Mr. Himes, anything on that since we went back one question?
Well, it's important to the other side on the gun debate that they point to people like me who aren't unreasonable. Now, Tucker Carlson likes to say I support confiscation. I know enough about the Second Amendment to know that that's impossible. I wouldn't support it if it were possible. But Mr. Arora suggests that I don't have any credibility because the other side doesn't think I have credibility. They call me a gun grabber. Look, as a public official, I can do my best to stand up for my constituents. I can't take responsibility for fringy people who look at me and say, that's a gun grabber who believes in confiscation. I'll tell you who I'm going to listen to. I spent a lot of time with Mark Barden, a father who lost his child, his little boy, at Sandy Hook Elementary School. That's who I'm going to stand up for. And I don't care if the other side, the fringe, thinks that a guy who simply supports what we passed here in the state of Connecticut wants to take their guns, even though I don't. I'm going to stand with Mark Barden.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, no applause, please. Thank you.
And all I'll say is getting things done is most important. I'm in this as a problem solver to get things done. What we heard just now was the whole idea that I don't care, I have an excuse why I can't get things done because somebody else is not listening to me. No, I take responsibility. If I were in your spot, I would take responsibility and say, hey, I didn't get them done. You know, it's your turn, Harry. Right? That's what I'm saying. I want to get things done. I'm going to go at it. I'm going to solve problems. And in 8 years, that's my self-imposed term limit. If things don't get done, you can fire me. But I do want to make sure I will leave nothing unturned to make sure better gun laws, universal background checks are in place because I take responsibility.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Please. You've taken away time to hear from them, so please hold your applause till the conclusion of the debate. Both candidates would really appreciate it, as would I. Thank you. All right, next question, if you're ready for the next question. Mr. Arora, you're first to respond. A rather large topic, health care. Please talk about your position on the Affordable Care Act and whether, if elected to Congress, you would join with other lawmakers to either protect and retain it or repeal it, or a third possibility to make changes to it. So a large question on the affordable health care.
So the ACA, Affordable Care Act, has broken our private insurance system. It has simply broken the private insurance system. If you take the three criteria which I've always used, affordability, access, and choice, on the actual insurance system, it's just collapsed. So in most exchanges, there is one choice, if so, and that too, if it's not affordable. Now, if you are subsidized, then perhaps you afford it. If you're not subsidized, you lose your insurance. That's what the fact of the matter is. Now, I always hear this idea that, well, it's working really great and we're going to tweak it. Well, this is a law which has been designed without reference to laws of economics, without taking in the power of incentives, and without embracing technology and innovation. And whether it be Soviet Union or whether it be Communist China or whether it be this healthcare law, it will not survive because it has been designed incorrectly. Now, what's my plan? I have a plan that we need to make sure that this 50 million individual group plan be restructured. And I would like to agree that let's just change it a little bit and tweak it a little bit, but of the 15 sections or the 13 titles in the law, I think 11 do not make sense. They are regulatory outreach. So the best way is to basically rewrite it, retaining the two central concepts which have worked. Number one, pre-existing conditions, coverage of pre-existing conditions or guaranteed issuance. And number two, the Medicaid expansion. Other than those two, how we do both of these, I think this law does not work. I have run models, I have run analysis. This law does not work, and any kind of propping or denying the fact that, well, the premiums were going up earlier, they just went up a little more, is just not right. At this point in time, $22,000 to $25,000 is the premium for a family of four. Which family, let's assume for a moment, I'm talking about middle-class families, they cannot afford it. You have broken the system because you've designed and written a law which does not work, and we need to change it. We need to put together a law which works so that we can provide, again, on all those three metrics, affordability, access, and choice.
Mr. Himes?
I was listening there for the plan. I didn't hear the plan. I heard criticism of the Affordable Care Act, some of which was fair, some of which was not. But I sure didn't hear a plan. And that's, of course, why the Republicans, after shutting down the government some time ago over the necessity to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and 68 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, actually stopped themselves from repealing the Affordable Care Act because they realized they had no plan. After years and years and years of shouting about how awful the Affordable Care Act, they had no plan. And so therefore they did not achieve their #1 political objective when they owned the government starting in January of 2017 of repealing the Affordable Care Act. What I did hear was Mr. Arora say that the Affordable Care Act does not work. If you go on and look at his website, he will call it a failure. We should ask ourselves, who does it not work for? For whom is it a failure? Because that will point you towards the different values on this stage. Let me give you a few facts. And what you're not going to hear me say is that the Affordable Care Act was perfect. What you will hear me say is that it dramatically improved the situation in health care in this country, and that we have a ways to go yet, particularly on prices and costs. There are 20 million people in the United States, almost 500,000 people in the state of Connecticut, 20 million people who have health insurance today that did not have it 10 years ago. That's a big deal. The horror of not having health insurance is a very, very scary thing. The personal bankruptcy rate in this country has been cut in half. Why? Because the #1 cause pre-ACA of personal bankruptcies was you got sick, you spent your money, and you were done and bankrupt. The personal bankruptcy rate has been cut in half. 20 million people. Pre-existing conditions. You can no longer be turned down by an insurance company if you have a pre-existing condition. Is that not a good thing? Is that a failure? Is that does not work? Now, by the way, this is the one time where, let me not say that. The notion that you can preserve pre-existing condition exclusions and without a personal mandate, you understand why that's not possible. You tell an insurance company, you need to take these people with diabetes and breast cancer or a young woman who may have a child someday, very expensive patients. You tell an insurance company that, you also need to tell the insurance company you're going to get healthy people paying premiums. That's the way it works. You can't tell an insurance company, you take all the sick people and we're going to let the very healthy 22-year-old not buy insurance. By the way, this is not a liberal idea, this is a conservative idea. The individual mandate came out of the Heritage Foundation. Why? Because I was an immortal 22-year-old once. Nothing was going to happen to me. So if I'm faced with the choice of spending $4,000 on health insurance or buying a widescreen TV, I'm buying that widescreen TV. But when I get run over by a bus, as sometimes happens to 22-year-olds, guess who pays for my care in the emergency room? All of you do. So people with pre-existing conditions. 70 million Americans on Medicare, which by the way is a single-payer system, Medicare, for those of you who want to raise hell about single-payer systems. Medicare, it used to be that once you got past a couple of $1,000s in expenditures for your drugs, you hit what was known as the donut hole. If we've got some senior citizens in the room, you know this. You now started paying fully for your drugs. Donut hole was closed by the Affordable Care Act. So it does not work. It's a failure, not for 20 million Americans who are living a very different life than they used to live. These are very vulnerable people. Not for the 50 or 60 million Americans who have pre-existing conditions, and not for the 70 million Americans who are on Medicare. So am I going to tell you that the Affordable Care Act was perfect? No, I'm not. I'm going to tell you that if we're serious about this, we will have a plan, and we will be willing to work together to start addressing the one issue which I think remains, and has been for 20 or 30 years, a big problem, which is the skyrocketing costs in the healthcare system.
I'm so glad I have extra time, because so much has been said which is non-factual, and you just mumbo-jumbo. I need to clear it up here. So first of all, let me answer Mr. Himes' question, who does this plan not work for? This plan does not work for middle-class people. Those in the middle class have been burnt by this plan. Let's just be clear. And by the way, if you take the numbers which Mr. Himes just said, the 20 million, for the fact if you take the number of uninsured, it actually fell by 14 when I looked at the latest numbers from the government. And that 14 million is actually less than the Medicaid expansion. So for middle class, 1 million people actually have lost insurance. 1 million people have lost insurance. Let's get the facts straight in the middle class. and they are paying through their nose, which he just agreed with. They are paying through their nose. They have lost insurance net. So access is, and they have one choice. Even when they get insurance through the subsidy, they have one choice. So access is poorer by 1 million, and we're talking about the middle class right now because I'm going to get to the other section as well. So access is poorer by 1 million. Choice is really poor, only one possibility, and cost through the roof. As a matter of fact, most of those plans which the middle class have now are catastrophic plans because the first $7,000 or $10,000, the insurance doesn't pay. You know that. We all know that. And I cannot believe that he can sit here denying that the middle class is being really hurt very badly. Badly. It's not a tweaking, oh, it's a little bit help. No, it's really bad. Now let me come to the economically disadvantaged. And he's right, the Medicaid expansion has covered 15 million people. And I'm very glad about that, but it's uneven, unfair, and inefficient. Because in many states, the coverage is not there. He will say, well, that's okay, those states are bad states. No, we got to take care of everyone, not just some here and some there. He's going to say, well, you know, it's efficient. No, it costs $10,000 per person on Medicaid. For a family of 4, we're spending $40,000 because of the basic idea that Medicaid plans can have no copay for a good reason. So what happens is that we need to put more accountability and more responsibility on the states administering it. And what we did in the Medicaid expansion was say we're going to pay 100% of it. And as a result, the states are like, well, fee for service, spend what you can. Mama is going to pay for it. Federal government is going to pay for it. And so we have an inefficient, unfair, and ineffective Medicaid expansion. And I am all for Medicaid expansion. I think we should cover all. We are spending $110 billion under the ACA. And we should be covering 30 million people in proper Medicaid expansion. So what I have to ask is, where did that money go for that 14 million people? We charged the money, and we didn't deliver. Because we are, again, going against the laws of economics. We have a law which doesn't use the power of incentives, and we have a law which does not embrace technology and innovation. And I have a plan. And I want to look at my time before I go through it. But he doesn't. What is his plan? Let's ask his plan. 1406. Actually, I do have a minute 30, so I will go over my plan. So my plan is threefold. Number one, on the individual market, we will take all those who have pre-existing conditions and put them in a separate pool, which will be subsidized by the $110 billion, actually $45 billion, which is right now subsidizing the pool for those folks. So we are covered. And for everybody else who is in the individual market, now mind it, the individual market is 50 million people. So everybody else, we will allow more options. We will allow the private market to work more dynamically. We will make the insurance market work. They have killed the private insurance market. That's just a fact. You know, he can basically do another spin and a narrative, and I'm like a private sector guy, so I don't know that very well. But these are the facts. They have killed the private insurance market. We're going to fix it. We're going to make sure the pre-existing conditions are covered by providing the subsidy, the money which is being used right now for that pool, and we're going to allow a lot of private sector innovation out there for the remaining. And now, by the way, what's that going to do? That's going to bring the 10 or 15 million who are not seeking, who right now are not getting coverage. And his point again about the fact that there's a kid who wants to buy insurance and is going to get a flat screen TV. What kind of stuff is this am I hearing? The reality is most people are very driven to buy insurance. I haven't met many people who say, well, if I can afford insurance, I will not get insurance and just buy flat screen TVs. That's not how it works. Most people let's have faith in Americans. The reality is what's happening is people say, I have a choice of paying mortgage. There's no $400 plan available, by the way, or a $900 plan for somebody who's 30 years old. And they say, well, I got to pay the mortgage. And so now what Mr. Himes and his plans do, they basically go at the guy and say, at the person, either a guy or girl, they say, well, not only do you not get the plan, I'm going to fine you $1,000 because you're a bad guy, you're a free rider. Well, what they were trying to do was decide between mortgage, food, and health care. And what did this plan, what did they do to him or her? They basically said, well, you're a bad guy. You're a bad person. Let's fine you. Let's penalize you. Maybe you just want to throw him, dunk him in the pool. What do you want to do with it? This person who cannot afford health care and has only one option, which is $800 or $1,000. Thank you.
Any other comment on health care, or shall we move on? Ladies and gentlemen, please.
Well, very quickly, Mr. Arora's facts are wrong. He says that we have killed the private insurance market. I think if you were to look at the profitability of Aetna or United Healthcare or any of the other insurance companies, you would find that they're doing all right. He says there is only one. There are a couple of states in the union, a couple of them, that in fact only have one insurance company, and that's a problem, which is actually why I supported during the work on the Affordable Care Act the creation of a public option, which would create always an additional option if the private market wasn't there to serve them. These tend to be rural states where it's very, very hard to serve a population. People live 200 miles from a hospital. This gets pretty technical. I will tell you that my plan is very, very simple. It is to stop the sabotage of the Affordable Care Act that President Trump has undertaken with the Republicans, and it is to make it better. And yes, premiums are a big deal, and Mr. Arora would have you believe that the rise in premiums is a Affordable Care Act generated problem. Here is a fact, and if Mr. Arora disagrees with me, he can offer an alternative fact. But since the Affordable Care Act has been in place, from 2008 to 2016, which is the latest data I have, total average family plan premiums in the aggregate have increased by 43%. That's a lot, and we have to do better, and we can do better, because Mr. Arora is exactly right about one thing, which is that our system is and always has been inefficient. And that's for a whole bunch of reasons. Doctors, hospitals get paid for doing more, not for keeping us healthy. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that's true. We spend 2 times per person on health care what any other developed country spends, and we get worse results. That's the very definition of inefficiency. The good news is there we've got opportunities to improve efficiency. But anyway, 43% in the aggregate since the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Between 2000 and 2008, that's right before the Affordable Care Act, 8 years, same period, premiums went up by 97%. So last point, even if we wound up with single payer, which is not something that I have signed up with, Medicare is a single payer system. I think it's still got some issues that needs to be worked out. Medicare uses private doctors, private hospitals, and buys pharmaceuticals from private pharmaceutical companies. Now look, we should have a conversation about where the government should intercede and where it shouldn't. But here's my last point. Health care, your health, your vaccinations, your treatment if you get cancer, it's not Doritos, it's not automobiles, it's not buying sugar at the store. We as Americans believe that markets work, but we also believe that if you have diabetes in the greatest country in the world and you don't have any extra money, we should take care of you. That's a fundamentally un-market idea, but it's one that each and every one of us should be proud of. So when you hear private sector, private market, yes, Boehringer Ingelheim, a drug company, is right up there in Ridgefield. Let's have lots of innovation. Let's have the private sector where it makes sense. But if you want a market in healthcare, think about what that means. Some people get to drive Rolls Royces. Some people aren't wealthy enough to own cars. That's the private market, and that's not what we want in our healthcare system.
Anything further?
So first thing is, I dislike
Ladies and gentlemen, please, we're going to ask you to move out if you cannot restrain yourselves. Mr. Arora.
Thank you. First thing is that I really object to your insinuations about facts and about numbers. I'm a fact-driven guy, and let me check your numbers here. You said 70 million on Medicare. Let's get that right. There are 50 million people on Medicare, not 70. So you don't have your numbers right in reality. So whereas my numbers are all based on very credible sources, which I'm ready to provide. So now let's basically think about a few things which Mr. Himes just mentioned. There is a clear case of difference between how we think about the world. Whether it is healthcare, whether it is food supply, whether it is defense, whether it is production of defense equipment, or whether it is the most important things, the ability for us to get the most important thing, our housing. We believe competitive market system works. We do not believe collectivism works. That is an ideology, that's an American idea, that's what we believe in, because it harnesses the power of incentives and does not allow significant government control, which will lead to inefficiency, corruption, and lobbying, and reimbursement game. Now, when Mr. Himes says the public options and he talks about let's do Medicare for all, let's see what he's really saying. What he's saying is that the 50 million system, which is designed for seniors, and needs to be improved actually, and which costs $13,000 per person, $13,000 per person. He thinks that that can be expanded to all 350 million. I think that is the worst idea possible, because you know why? It's going to destroy. It is going to destroy the Medicare coverage for our seniors. And you can really look at all of the countries which have single payers. Who gets hurt the most? Who gets in line the most? The seniors. You're an 82-year-old and you're told, well, really, you want a hip transplant, or do you really want a bypass surgery? The cost benefit doesn't work. That's UK, that's Canada for you. And they all come to the United States to basically get their surgery if they can afford to, but many can't. Many can't. So I really want to make sure that everybody understands that this idea of expanding the 50 million, $13,000 a person program to 325 million people, which is going to be infested with corruption, with lobbying, with the reimbursement games. Right now, try changing something in Medicare, even if it makes total sense. The lobbyists are going to be all over there. And I think Mr. Himes knows a thing or two about it. He's basically been taking money like next to like anything over the last decade. $5.4 million from corporate PACs, right? And maybe lots of those are medical oriented. So my point is it does not work. And by the way, one more thing, that the reason the insurance companies are still making money is because of the subsidy of the government. They are now making money because of the fact that private individuals are going around and buying insurance. They're losing money on that. That's why they're only very predominant where the entire program, the entire exchange, the healthcare exchange is basically subsidized. And so all of these ideas point to one thing, which is we need a competitive market solution, well-designed. The problem here is not with the competitive market solution. The problem here is with its design. Very poor design, and the problem is people make mistakes. Maybe Mr. Himes and his party made a mistake, but they don't want to admit it. They want to basically double down on a mistake and now basically really nationalize and socialize the entire system of 350 million when it's very clear that they failed in the 50 million design which they did. And my plan, and what I would suggest is we'll fix this. We'll have a new design for a system which will work, and as I said, we'll keep the pre-existing separately, subsidize them, and make the remaining a very private sector system. Thank you.
Anything more on this issue, or are you ready for the next one?
Just 30 seconds, and I'll get us away from healthcare here. When my friends on the other side of the aisle don't have ideas, and when they are trying to hide the fact that their one major accomplishment in this Congress was to take $2 trillion of your money and hand it to the very wealthiest people and to corporations in this country, when they don't have ideas, they say three words. And those three words are Nancy, Pelosi, and socialism. That's what they do. In 1961, Ronald Reagan didn't agree with his policies, but boy, do I miss that optimism and that sense of morning in America. Ronald Reagan gave a speech in 1961 in which he said, I need each and every one of you to stand up against the socialism that is encroaching in our country. As he said, if you don't argue against this program, I promise you, just as surely as the sun will come up tomorrow and behind will come every other federal program until one day we will awake to find that we have socialism. And he said, and if you don't do this, and if I don't do it, one of these days you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children, this is Ronald Reagan speaking only the way Ronald Reagan can speak, telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in America when men were free. He gave that speech to oppose Medicare. Socialism is what they do when a good idea comes forward and they don't know how to counter it.
I have given all facts, and all I will say is take only 5 seconds. Please make your decision made on facts. All here I see is narratives and this whole flowering language which Mr. Himes is powerful at, but his facts are wrong, and his system doesn't work. It's failed.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're taking away from your candidate's time. Now, I'm going to assert that I think we have dealt with this issue to the extent that is possible this evening. Are you ready to move on to another question? All right. Mr. Himes, you're first, and of course, this is another very simple question, simple issue like health care. Everyone wants secure national borders. How should the government control undocumented immigrants in a humane way that keeps families together? And Mr. Himes, you're first.
First, the border must be secure. I spend an awful lot of my time as a member of the Intelligence Committee looking at the vulnerability associated with a porous border. Drugs come across our southern border. There is the possibility that terrorists could come across the southern border. We need good border security. I would have been delighted in the House to vote on a bill that received strong bipartisan support in the Senate, which would have invested significantly in border security. A wall, by the way, is a stupid idea. I'm just going to call it for what it is. There's a reason why you haven't heard of the wall as an idea on the border until Donald Trump thought it was a good idea, because security experts understand that a wall won't work. Half the people who are here in this country on an undocumented basis don't sneak across the border. They get a tourist visa, or they're au pairs, or they get some other kind of visa, and they stay. So half of the undocumented problem doesn't even sneak across a border. A wall will cost you and me somewhere between $30 and $70 billion, and it will not work. So I hope we can dispose of that. The Congress, owned by the Republicans these days, has not funded that wall. That should tell you something. To the humane question, I think pretty much everybody in this room, I would hope, would oppose the policy that President Trump put into place, whereby people coming across our border would automatically be put into the criminal justice system, which forbids children from being in criminal jails. And as a result, families were separated. And you and I saw the images, and it is something that none of us want to ever own as Americans. That is not who we are. So I'm very glad that the president backed off that policy. Even though he said it was a Democrat law that needed to be changed, he backed off the problem that he created. And that points us in the direction of what do we do? We go back to exactly the bill that in 2013 the Senate passed with 68 senators. It did 3 things. It provided money for border security, which I would be delighted to support. It solved the problem by creating something called E-Verify. People come here for 2 reasons, really, most people. Because they're fleeing violence in places like El Salvador or Guatemala or Honduras. If you thought your child was going to die, you would leave too. Or because they can make, just to pick a number, $2 a day in Honduras, and they can make $6 an hour in Stanford in a restaurant or working for a contractor. I don't care how big your wall is. As long as the incentive is there, they will find a way. So we do something that the bill called E-Verify. Everybody has a mechanism, it could be technological, to show an employer that they're entitled to work here. And if the person is verified, the employer hires them. If the employer chooses to cheat, contractors, restaurants, cleaning services want to hire folks who are not, then the law comes down hard on them. Let me close on the third part, because it's about humaneness. We have 11 million people in this country who are undocumented. You and I both know some of these people. What do you do about them? It would cost a staggering amount of money to deport all of those 11 million people, and you don't want to do that because some of those have spouses and kids who are U.S. citizens. And so the Senate bill, which I would have supported, had a rigorous earned path to citizenship. 10 years, keep a job, pay your taxes, pay us a fine because you broke law, and we are a nation of laws. And put whatever else you want on top of that, learn English, whatever it is. But the point is, it had a very rigorous earned path to citizenship. That bill passed the Senate with 68 votes, and John Boehner, Speaker of the House, never brought it up in the House. And so here we're having this conversation. Last point, and this is not a Republican or a Democratic point. We cannot do what this president does, which is to consistently dehumanize human beings, to suggest that all people who are coming across the border are not coming because they fear what might happen to them in San Salvador or because they're looking to make a little more money than they could in Honduras, but because they're MS-13, because they're criminals, and because they're here to perpetrate crimes and to kill you. That's dehumanization. And none of us, Democrat or Republican, should tolerate that kind of language in a nation of immigrants from the President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, thank you. Mr. Arora, your response?
Absolutely. So I really like the fact that Mr. Himes does agree that we need strong border security and need to seal our border. But then why did he not vote for H.R. 6136 earlier this season, where there were only two elements to it? Number one, provide additional resources for border security, including increasing the number of border security patrol, which is right now at 16,500, to 25,000, including providing more money for equipment and technology, and including some money for fencing or wall. Now, what it also did was provide for our DACA kids to have a path, and he voted against them. He voted against DACA kids, he voted against border security, and he comes here and you can say anything you want. And as a matter of fact, let me quote something else, what I heard from Mr. Himes on CNN the other day. He won't have a discussion with me, that's very difficult, but he will say all of these things on CNN. He said, well, whatever you want to say, Democratic candidates, just say it, Medicare for all, no ICE, abolish ICE, no open borders, let's just win. And so then he says, well, I am ready to do anything. Well, there's no credibility once again. Because once you get on CNN, once you get on national media and say, you can say anything, it's all about winning elections. You really think anybody is going to believe you anymore? And that's the problem we have. What we want is to make sure that our border security is strong, because he's right. He's really right that the opioids do come from there. The fentanyl, which is coming from across the border, is devastating our communities. We need to stop that. And he's wrong in saying that it's 50% who come and overstates 25%. And I have looked at that number because that number gets provided by the government in a very difficult way, because it's overstays what they provide. So as by now you know, I'm a data cruncher. And so that number comes, any way you look, there are a few ways you can look at it, it comes to 25%. So again, he's basically pushing the numbers his way just to prove a point. No, more people do come because they just walk through the southwest border. And now, what do we really need in immigration reform? What we need is a process to handle expeditiously when people show up. And I always say, firm, compassionate, and firm. We have to be very compassionate. I agree with you, sir, fully. We have to be compassionate. That's our values. But we have to be firm. But right now, the way the immigration reform is written is that it ends up that it takes a long time, and we have to let them in our country for extended period of time, and by the time their turn arrives to come in front of the court, they never show up. So there is a way that we can change the process to expeditiously take care of anybody who shows up at the border. And by the way, if they're really fleeing violence, why do they not show up at the first port, which is most likely in Guatemala or in Mexico? No, they don't. They come to the United States. You know why? Because a very large proportion of folks who come here illegally are coming from the economic opportunity. And I don't blame them. But we have our problems too. We have a very large number of people in our country who are economically disadvantaged and whom we do need to help, and it's our responsibility. If you look at our schools in our community right now, we are being overloaded with folks who are undocumented, and it is hurting. It is hurting the schooling for many, and schooling dollars for many of our school systems. And again, I am one who would really want to make sure that whatever we decide as a community on refugees as well as asylum, we need to really open-heartedly, fairly implement that. But this whole idea that Republicans are bad and they're doing, this is again divisiveness we don't have to put up with. I want you to give me an opportunity so that we can bring the facts out. And I'm happy to step up to anybody in my party or their party or anybody to do the right thing. Thank you.
Go ahead. Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, very
Hines?
quickly. I don't know what this say anything is about. I think Mr. Arora is referring to a conversation I had about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who ran on free education for all or I guess 2 years of college for all and single-payer health care. And I think I said, look, what may work electorally in Queens may be different than what works in Fairfield County, but no, I have never said say anything that winning is everything, and my constituents know that that's not the way I think. Number two, and this is important, I take some umbrage over the notion that I voted against DACA. I've been a warrior for the DACA children for a very, very long time, including back in 2014 when I took a dreamer to the State of the Union address, a young man named Lucas Cordognola, who was a dreamer. And I fully supported President Obama when he, through executive action, normalized the status of the dreamers. And I just thought it was a brutal act of vandalism when, for no gain whatsoever, President Trump rescinded that and threw almost 1 million kids into total uncertainty. Let's talk about the bill. Well, we're contesting a lot of facts here. When it comes to bills on the floor of the House, I know something about them. The bill that Mr. Arora is referring to, and he said that I say that all Republicans are bad, I don't. The bill that Mr. Arora is referring to was known as the Goodlatte bill. It did not receive a single Democratic vote, and it lost 112 Republican votes. They barely got a majority of the Republican caucus in the House. It got obliterated on the floor. Why? Because it was a brutal bill. It said, dreamers, you get temporary status so long as the wall doesn't stop being built. The moment the wall stops being built, you get thrown back into this world of uncertainty. By the way, it had $30 billion, $30 billion for the wall, which is a wild waste of your money. And it had no path for permanent normalization for those dreamers. So you can check this fact. This bill that Mr. Arora would have had me vote for lost half of the Republican caucus against the president today. That's quite a feat, because it was a brutal and cruel bill.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying, that if you are going to stand for your principles, doesn't matter who else is voting for it. We needed moderate Democrats out there, and all moderate Republicans were in for there. And that's what really the challenge is. He's going to basically just vote for his party line, voting 95% or more in line with his party, and again now say all of these things that he's basically a moderate or an independent. He's not. He's basically a rubber stamp here for whatever the party is saying. Otherwise, why is he not stepping up? Leave alone who did not sign. There were 125 congressmen who signed that bill, all Republicans. Why did he not sign? Why did he not sign to the bill? It would have provided a path to citizenship for DACA kids.
No, it wouldn't. That's just not
Excuse me, audience. This is not audience participation event. So,
Thank you.
Mr. Hines.
I'll make this point again. I voted against my party on a number of things that were quite important. The 95% figure, 3/4 of the votes we take are procedural votes about, rules and this sort of thing. But no, I'm not going to join Steve King and the fire breathers in the Republican Party to compromise on the lives of dreamers. I am a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus. Every single week we have lunch with Republicans. We talk about bills we can work on. I'm chairman of the New Democrat Coalition. These are the Democrats from purple states who are hungry for ways to work with Republicans. It's become a little harder to do, quite frankly, under President Donald Trump. It was a little easier before this guy became president to work with Republicans. But no, I am not going to join. I will, when reasonable Republicans and reasonable Democrats come together, you will be able to count on me being there. When the most aggressive, xenophobic, amoral extreme tries and fails to pass a bill, I will not be part of that.
Are you? Ladies and gentlemen, we all want to hear from these two candidates, and you're taking away their time. And also, gentlemen, I've just gotten a note that there's some people sitting in the back who are having a little trouble hearing you, so perhaps you could move your microphones a little closer. And so, anything else on this topic? All right, next question. And Mr. Arora, you're the first to respond. Excuse me. The basic question is, where does climate change rank on your list of priorities for national legislation? And along with that, what steps would you propose to decrease carbon pollution in the air, to integrate climate change as much as possible? To mitigate, mitigate. What steps do you propose to decrease carbon pollution in the air to mitigate climate change as much as possible? So, generally
Yes.
on climate change.
Yes, so I believe this is a very big issue we need to address. We need to address this issue. Science tells us we cannot afford a 2-degree warming. We should not allow even a 1.5-degree warming. But at this point, I would practically say we need to stop the 2-degree warming. Let me give you the facts again. 38 billion tons. I'll only give a few numbers because I have studied this over the last 20 years as an investment manager in this area. 38 billion tons is the amount of carbon dioxide released last year. 25 billion tons was what was released in 2000. We in America released 5 billion last year, and I'm rounding this a little bit, not much. We were releasing it 5.5 in 2000. During this period of time, our economy has grown nearly 50% over these 18 years. So we are doing a lot, and we should do more. But this is what is required to solve this problem. We need to hold other countries responsible. Not just showmanship, not just the Paris Agreement. Hey, listen, just show us you're trying to do something. They are growing, the rest of the world is growing their carbon dioxide emissions by 1 billion tons a year. 1 billion tons, so 38 becomes 39. We will go from 5 to 4.995 next year. That's general trajectory we are on. So 5 years from now, even if we went to 0, they would have covered more than that. Now, we don't need any international agreement to decide amongst ourselves whether we want to go to 4 or to 3 or to 0. There's a cost-benefit trade-off, and we should be, as a country, be ready to take that on. And most of it is going to be done through technology and to right choice of investment. But when it comes to international, where this whole play is, because whatever we may do is not going to stop us from getting to 2 degrees. If we do not stop them, we have to convince them, we have to articulate to them. And by the way, they are using that same excessive carbon emissions to actually get even a trade advantage. Because think about this. If you cannot make something in the United States, you go to some other country out there, you can emit 3 times the emissions, and you're more competitive. So my point is, we need to do 2 things. And I'm very serious about it, and I would advocate and articulate this in a very powerful way and get things done. Number 1, we need to make sure that we commit other countries that we will reduce if you stop increasing. That's fair, right? We will reduce, and we can have, at that point, even some kind of a scale where we would reduce. But right now, we can't just give away. That's a bad way to deal with the problem. We said, well, you can increase emissions up to 2030. So you can increase from 38 to 50 billion tons. At that point, I don't think anything matters. We will go to 2 degrees Celsius. So what I want to point out here is that I am here to provide solutions, to fix problems, and to actually get to the bottom of things. Here is somebody who's going to basically, again, come out and say, well, you know, we're not doing enough. Yes, we are not. We can do more. But we are doing a lot because the numbers I gave you, from 2000 to 2018, we decreased the amount of our carbon emissions while we grew our economy 50%. And I do think if we really, and by the way, where did most of those savings come from? By switching from coal to natural gas. And you know, the left does not want to think about it that way. They think all fossil fuels are bad. As a matter of fact, we have wanted to get a natural gas pipe into Connecticut from Marcellus, which is in Pennsylvania. Can't get it done because of the narrative. Every fossil fuel is bad. All the improvements, most of the improvements have come either from efficiency or from replacement of the fuel. And by the way, we are right now burning 700 million tons of coal. Guess what the rest of the world is burning? 5 billion tons. So let's keep the whole thing with a way, address this whole thing, how we solve problems. That's why I'm running for office, to basically solve problems, to bring rigor, to bring facts, and to not do a spin or a narrative. Thank you.
Mr. Himes?
I agree with a lot of that. I disagree with 2 points, but I will just observe that for a guy who's bringing solutions, I didn't hear a single solution, not a single proposal, not cap and trade, not a carbon tax, not clean coal. I didn't hear a single solution. And this is a problem urgent enough that it needs solution. But nonetheless, I'm very happy that Mr. Arora agrees that this is a serious problem, because it is. The areas in which I would disagree, number one, I do agree that we need to hold other countries responsible. But again, what's the next sentence? What's the actual solution? Are we going to float the Fifth Fleet off the coast of China and militarily force them? I don't think so. I do know how we have persuaded countries around the world to do things for 100 years. We've led. We've led. We've said, look what we're doing. Look what we're doing on human rights. Look what we're doing on electrifying people's homes in the Tennessee Valley. We've led. We've demonstrated. Mr. Arora says we're doing a lot. We're withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, which was, by the way, no mandatory. It was voluntary limits. We have a president who just last week said, well, this report that suggests we're in a whole heck of a lot of trouble, those scientists may have a political agenda. That is not leading. The way we convince countries to do things, except in those very limited number of awful occasions when we convince them with the Pentagon, is by leading. And we are not leading, we are backsliding. Now, leading is an abstraction, which Mr. Arora is trading in this evening, so let me actually offer you a couple of very specific solutions, because they're being implemented all around this country despite the federal government. We have mileage requirements that the Obama administration put on automobiles that the Trump administration wants to reverse. We should be looking for better mileage in our cars. Lots of municipalities and states are actually putting building codes in place that would require buildings to be reasonably energy efficient. We're teaching people about the importance of this. Those are all specific things we can do. Now, I don't know how my opponent will feel about this, but there is a bipartisan idea out there that really moves the needle. Here's a real solution, and it's supported by Republicans and Democrats, and get this, the chief executive officer of ExxonMobil. And that idea is a fully refundable, let me say those two words again, fully refundable carbon tax. That changes everything. And the idea of a fully refundable carbon tax is you put a little bit of a tax on the use of carbon fuels, and then at the end of the year, you give it all back to the American people. So the government doesn't get a honeypot, you give it back. What that does is it just levels the playing field between sustainable energy and carbon-based energy sources. So in the spirit of offering up a couple of ideas, first and most importantly, we should lead. And secondly, we should look at what states and municipalities, along the examples I just gave you, are doing that would actually, in a way that would actually fix this problem.
And I again fully agree that we should lead. But you know what we've been doing? We have been pandering. And that's what I have objection with. We cannot be naive. The world increased, I gave you the number, from 25 to 38. And we basically said, yes, you can be voluntary. You can go increase your emissions till 2030, go to 50. Well, by the time, if we go to 50 billion tons, it's all over. Regard for facts is important. And how can you say that we're not leading? We have to bring their feet to the fire and say, listen, you cannot keep increasing at the rate which you are. You cannot. We have to basically compel them and say, yes, we will reduce. We will commit to reduce. What we did was, yeah, we'll reduce by 25% and you can increase by 50. What are we thinking? Are we naive? Are we being taken advantage of? And our rep is saying, our representation here is sitting here saying, well, you know, that's okay. Let us being taken advantage of. No big deal. That's leadership. No, leadership is basically making them see and compelling them to step up. And as a matter of fact, it is in their interest. It's one planet. It's one mankind. We have to do it together. But sometimes we have to basically compel, push a little bit. We haven't.
How?
And by the way, let me finish here. And for number two, and I will address that how as well. As I said, we should have made a precondition at that time itself that we will reduce once you freeze. And you should freeze, if not in 1 year, maybe in 2 years. We gave them up to 2030. At that time, the whole thing blows up anyways. And finally, on the second issue of taking leadership, and having a plan. The plan which Mr. Himes just mentioned, first of all, I really want to go through it in detail. We don't have time, but I can't. And it would not work. What would work is basically a carbon tax with a cap and trade. But there's a problem with that. We need to articulate. It will raise the price of electricity and utilities. It will. And this has been tried. This is not new. It's been tried in Europe. It's been tried in other countries. It will double, if maybe 50% to double the price of electricity. And we have to figure out how to implement it correctly. And I would love to say, well, let's just put it in. But I do think that if we design that system, we better do it very carefully. Because I know the lobbyists from whom the money is being going to various election campaigns will be all over. They will design it where we will be the losers. We will be paying a lot more, and instead of going from 5 to 4.995, we might go from 5 to 4.9. And so there is this whole thing. Let's design a plan where we can go from our current emissions of carbon dioxide in a material manner and keep control over the costs so that those who are economically disadvantaged just now do not have another challenge of how they heat their homes or get electricity. So we need to address that. And more importantly, let it be clear, whatever we do, if we do not ask the other countries to freeze their emissions at an early date, in a year, 2, or 3, it does not matter because it's really bad. And the only way we're going to do it is by, just as you said, making it preconditional, that we will do this if you do that, and putting other things on the table as well.
Anything else
Thank you.
on that time? Okay. Next question, and Mr. Himes, you're the first to respond. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling, what role should Congress play in assuring that citizens are fully informed about the source and identities of corporations, unions, super PACs, and individuals who are trying to influence our votes? Mr. Himes.
Thank you. Two things I would say about that. Number one, in the wake of the Citizens United decision and the decision that the expenditure of dollars for candidates is protected First Amendment speech, a decision I completely disagree with. We are constrained in what we can do, because the Supreme Court has said when you want to write $1 million check to a super PAC, that's you exercising your First Amendment rights. So sadly, that puts us in the position of having to regulate the way in which that happens. So a couple of principles that I think are very important and that I will support and have supported. And let me be very clear up front here. I play in the current imperfect system. I spend an awful lot of my time, as do all of my colleagues and challengers and others, calling people on the phone and asking for money, which is a waste of my time, their time, and not a good system. So any political contribution needs to be attached to the individual who made it. The individual needs to own it. That is not where we are today. You can give to a super PAC and remain anonymous. I would like to see the structures that allow that to happen. These so-called social benefit organizations that are out there, these are the super PACs, really cracked down on by the IRS. A total exclusion of foreign giving to our campaigns. Corporate giving voted on by corporate boards if it's going to be done. That all, like these little things we can do to make a little bit of a difference on climate change, those things in the aggregate will make a little bit of a difference on the tidal waves of money that are in our system. And again, I'm here to tell you how much of a waste of time that is. Someday we need to get the Supreme Court, either through reversing Citizens United or through an even less likely constitutional amendment, to understand that there may be an argument for political expenditures being free speech, but it is countermanded by the fundamental value that I think our political system has, which is one person, one vote. Not $1, one vote, one person, one vote. So I hope, and I have signed up to every constitutional amendment, which I will admit is not happening anytime soon, to that effect, because I just believe our country would be a better place, and Harry Arora and Jim Himes and every other candidate out there would spend more time on the issues and more time with their constituents if we could do what Connecticut has done and offer a program, or at least find other ways to reduce the amount of money that is sloshing around our political system.
Yeah, I
Mr.
fully
Arora?
agree that the amount of money sloshing around the system is really bad. But I want to say something. Let's take personal responsibility. Let's take personal responsibility. If you don't have to raise money. You have several super PACs supporting you. You have, when I entered this race, people said, well, you can't take Mr. Himes on. He's got tens and hundreds of millions lining behind him. You're not going to do it. How are you going to do it? Just drop out even before you begin, Harry. That's what they told me. I said, listen, I'm going to raise a small amount of money, and I'm going to make it go farther and use it judiciously. And I believe in American people. I believe that everybody will listen to my message. And you need some money. You need some amount of money. But here is Mr. Himes raising money over money when he doesn't even need it. And then he gives it to other candidates. Now, let me ask you a question. Why would you do that? Why would you? And then Mr. Himes will say, well, I'm not being influenced. I'm above influence. Well, in 2010, when you worked on the Dodd-Frank law, you were the most aggressive in terms of your posture to the financial industry. You were holding them responsible. They wanted this. You're like, no way. In 2008, you had gotten very small amount of donations from the PACs on the financial industry. By 2016, 2018, you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions. I stopped counting on my spreadsheet at some point. Millions of dollars from super PACs, PACs on the financial industry. And suddenly you found that the same Dodd-Frank law really needed changes. Something which we had already said it's an overreach. I could read the law and say, what are you doing, sir? And in 2018, you realized it was overreach, and you changed quite a lot of it and made it more reasonable. I would have liked it a little more, and more importantly, I would have liked it to be done in 2010 in the first go, because that 8 years was when credit was tight, and that law made credit tighter. As a result, we could not get enough money in the hands of small businesses. I always used to joke, between 2010 and 2018, if Apple wanted money, they had 0% access. They could borrow money at 0%. If you wanted to rebuild a house out here or start a small business here in Stamford, Connecticut or Wilton, Connecticut, there was no price for it. Why? Because this law really brought in such difficult restrictions of financial institutions that they could not lend. And so once again, what I'm saying is we need to take away the influence of money, and we need to start with personal responsibility. And I do agree, at the time when a window opens, we need to make sure we institutionalize it and support all of those ideas. But start with your own self. And I take personal responsibility, and I'm running to basically serve you, to serve our community. I'm not going to take any money from corporate PACs. Thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Shh. Anything else to add? All right. We are very close to closing statements, so I'm going to ask one question and ask you just to give a very brief answer. What do you feel you could, let me just, let's see, it's Mr. Arora's turn to be first. What do you feel you can do in Congress to promote a more bipartisan Congress that works for the American people? One thing from each of you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Surely. What do you feel you can do in Congress to promote a more bipartisan Congress that works for the American people? A similar question is, what will you do to have a civic dialogue in Washington and avoid partisanship? That's the basis of the questions.
So the simplest and the shortest answer is focus on facts and rigorous respect for getting things done. And try to convince we are all on the same team. All of us, Mr. Himes, myself, all of us, some of you who are on this or may vote this way or that way, we are all on the same American team. And I would take this message strong. I would make sure that I convey it through my words, through my eyes, through my ears, in a way, in a multifaceted manner, that I am here to solve problems and we are all on the same team.
Mr. Himes, your one thing you might be able to do? Or try to do?
I think the best individual members of Congress can do is just model behavior, not challenge people's motivations, not call people treasonous, as our president does to the Democrats, not ask people to believe that they are the only source of truth, which I've been doing this for a while. I know a lot of you. You know in my town hall meetings, I try to find ways to find ideas that are supported by both sides of the aisle. I don't ever point at Republicans as always being wrong. I think as individuals, all we can do is model the kind of good behavior that got me elected the chairman of the New Democrat Coalition. These are the moderate Democrats. Institutionally, because ultimately this is an institutional problem, once again, I have to look to American citizens and say, we've got an obligation. We've got an obligation to understand that the system only works when you've got two parties. My party needs a Republican Party offering rebuttals and good ideas of their own. That's the way the system works. It doesn't work today, but to my Democratic friends, I would say we don't have a monopoly on truth. We have to be willing to compromise. Right now, we're in a world where it's good versus evil, depending on what side you are. And as American citizens, we've got to demand better than that. We've got to understand that there are no easy answers, that there is nothing that is black and white, and that compromise is the way we get things done in this country.
All right, and the time has come for closing statements, so the timers need to clear their stopwatches. Each of you has 2 minutes, and they will be holding up a sign when you've got a minute left and when you have 30 seconds left and when it's time to stop. So, Mr. Arora, you're first. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. The contrast between my policies and Mr. Himes' policies are very clear here. I stand to solve problems for all of us. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Greens, Libertarians, everyone. His record shows he is party first. I want to focus on facts. He focuses on narrative. I am strongly committed to a competitive economy with strong regulation to make sure there's a fair playing field. He's waffling. Sometimes it's socialism, sometimes it's not. Sometimes government can control everything. I don't know. I want to get things done. He marvels in making excuses. And when it comes to rights, civil rights, minority rights, protecting our freedoms, look at me. I am going to be out there making sure that we fight for them like no tomorrow. If that is an issue which is important to any one of you, you have to consider my candidacy because just of who I am. I came to this country 25 years ago as a student, and only by the opportunity and education I sit here today to ask for your support in representing you. And after 10 years, Connecticut needs a new start. We need new ideas, new energy. We need change. I believe America is the greatest country on earth, and I want to make sure that we put forward policies and ideas to keep it that way for our children, our grandchildren, and forever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Himes, you have your 2-minute closing statement.
Thank you, Kay, and let me thank the League of Women Voters again. I'm going to make you 3 pledges that I think will resonate with the way I have represented this district. First of all, I will continue to fight day in and day out for what this district needs. We didn't talk about some of the things that the district needs, like massive investments in our transportation infrastructure, the $136 million that I was instrumental in bringing to rebuild the Walk Bridge, the money that went into Steel Point and Bridgeport, the money that went into the Stanford Transportation Center, the single busiest train station between New York and Boston. I will continue to fight like a Wolverine for those sorts of things because this district deserves it. Secondly, you expect this of me. I will be independent. And despite what Mr. Arora says, you know the record. He illustrated perfectly the fact that I didn't particularly please the banking industry, many of whom live here in my district, by helping to write Dodd-Frank. And yes, over time, I'm going to try to find the right balance, and every time I do that, I'm going to tick off one side or the other. For the other side, I was the only vote in New England, the only Democratic vote in New England for Trade Promotion Authority, which would have allowed us to consider the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I understand became toxic to both candidates, but we are a trading state. I was the only vote in New England. The AFL-CIO did not endorse me because of that, and the reason for that is because I will listen not to Wall Street, not to anybody with a super PAC, not to the AFL-CIO or any other union, but to you. The third pledge I make to you, which I wish I didn't have to pledge, I'm taking a little guff up here for being on TV. When the president goes on and says the Justice Department is a compromised organization, our elections are rigged, women are dogs, women are horse faces, when the president says
Please, ladies and
that
gentlemen.
there are two sides to every story when Nazis are marching in Charlottesville, I am going to go on TV, I'm going to go on the rooftops, and I'm going to say that is not who we are. If
Your time is up.
If you want silence, silence,
Mr. Himes, your
you
time
can
is
elect
up.
the other guy. I will shout that from the rooftops.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously, courtesy is what we need to see from all of us. We appreciate your participation this evening. We appreciate your being here. Obviously, we thank the candidates, both of whom are running for office, and we thank the timers, the local folks who helped put all this together, which takes a fair amount of time. And please, obviously, vote on November 6th. Thank you.